All right, kids, tonight we're going to talk about war. Which war? The Great War. Take a look at this poster and think about what is it trying to say. So as you know, we've talked about the Great War a little bit in class. Now, the big question is, how does this differ from all previous wars? And as we said, great applies to the size, not the fact that it's a fantastic war. So alliances plus colonies equal a much bigger war. As we talked about in class, this really should have only been an Austrian-Serbian war. But since they were both allies with so many big European countries, it got out of hand in literally 1 week. Colonists of these countries were encouraged, basically forced to fight in these colonial armies in wherever in the world the mother country needed them to fight. A second thing that makes the Great War much bigger is that, and you saw this in the crash course video, new weapons plus old strategies equal death, or simply failure when it comes to the battlefield. And lastly, as we talked about as well, nationalism has prepared everyone to fight, but people are basically excited about going to war. Now they can actually prove that their country is the best. As I said, this is the last time people will actively cheer when war is declared. So in review, the Great War was caused by 3 things, and then it started because of an assassination, okay? So the first thing, as we talked about, was alliances. More countries are now obligated to fight to defend their allies. Secondly, nationalism says that people have been primed for war for literally decades because their governments have been telling them just how great they are, okay? They've been going to public schools where they've learned about their heroes. They've been pledging their allegiance to the flag. They've been singing nationalistic songs. So now they finally get a chance to prove that they are the best. And then lastly, you have militarism, total war. This is when countries have been actively building up their militaries in preparation for war. So literally, they're building more battleships than ever. Airplanes are now starting to be produced. Bigger and more efficient weapons, okay, which include bigger bombs called shells, are being produced. Machine guns are being produced. So the end result of all of this is that when war does happen, it's not going to be a small war. It's not going to be a fast war, okay? It'll be a very big war, and it'll last forever, it seems, because no one wants to surrender. If you surrender, you're admitting that you are inferior to the rest, and no one wants to do that. If you look at this map right now, you can see the main alliances of the Great War. You have 2 basic alliances, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. Later, we'll simply look at these people as allies and central powers, okay? The main allies going into this war were the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, and the main central powers going into the war were Germany, Austria, the Ottoman Empire, and Italy. Notice Italy is green. Italy switches sides right as the war starts. Later, you will add countries like the United States to the allies. And then, as we said earlier, you're adding all of the colonies from around the world. Now, look at the central powers, especially Germany. Tell me, why is Germany at a disadvantage in this war? This is like the map you saw in the crash course video, and you can see really the global impact of the colonies. This is at the outbreak of the war, so the United States is not added. So basically, these are territories of Russia, France, and England, as well as territories of Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. If you look around the world, you can see just how the allies, or the Triple Alliance members, have more possessions, thus an advantage. So as we talked about earlier, nationalism is a key component to starting this war. You can see this in this poster. You see lots of flags. You know that it's nationalism because you see the different costumes that the different nationalities wear. You see the different flags are very prominently displayed. You can also tell who created the poster by looking who's at the very center and who's the biggest. That's right, Great Britain. This is another British example of nationalism, and it actually looks a lot like the United States Uncle Sam World War II recruitment poster. But this is actually a real person. Uncle Sam's not a real person. This is a guy called Lord Kitchener, who's a military hero in England. He helped win some battles in Africa in the colonial wars. And it says, Britain, Lord Kitchener wants you. Join your country's army, God save the king. If that's not nationalism, I don't know what is. So this is also a new war of new technologies, okay? And this is when war becomes more efficient, meaning less cost, more production. Well, in this case, if a weapon is more efficient, it means it kills more people. So you see a lot of new types of weapons or military vehicles that debut in this war. The first is the tank, as you see right here. The tank is more like a moving shield than anything else. So that's what we will look at it as. It's not all that fast, it's not all that powerful, but basically it moves and you can stand behind it. Probably a bigger impact in the war was the use of airplanes. Flight is only about 10 years old when the war starts. 1904 is when the Wright brothers fly an airplane in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So 10 years later, you've adapted that into what you're looking at right now. And these are two actual World War I airplanes. A biplane is the one at the bottom, 2 wings. A triplane is the one at the top, 3 wings. You see a German plane at the top and a British plane at the bottom. Notice these aren't very sophisticated. You can carry bombs, but you have to carry them in your lap and throw them overboard. So this isn't very accurate. However, this does lead to a new sort of way of fighting, and that's in the air above the battlefields. Probably even scarier is what's happening below the surface, and these are U-boats, okay, or Unterseeboots, submarines that all countries had them, but the Germans had the most. And this is where the submarine would go underwater and attack different types of boats, sometimes like cruise ships, sometimes military ships, sometimes just supply ships. So basically there's a presence below the water that is always lurking, waiting to attack, which makes people very paranoid. In this picture you can see 2 examples of new technologies. The machine gun, which we've talked about in Africa before. Now there's simply a lot more of them to be used in the war. And secondly, these guys are wearing gas masks because poison gas is a new technology used in the war. And then you have guns that are simply bigger than you've ever imagined. This is actually a gun called the Paris gun. And look how small the person is next to how big the gun is. This is like a cannon that can fire a bomb, a shell, that's about 250 pounds. And it can shoot something about 75 miles away, okay? To put in perspective, that's basically you hitting Guatemala from here, okay? It's not super accurate, but it's meant to create sort of fear and paranoia. And this is a German bomb, or German gun that they used to hit Paris from about 75 or 80 miles away. So, as I showed you earlier in a map, there are actually 2 fronts to the war. There's the Western Front right here, and the Eastern Front right here. A front is simply where you're fighting. So the Western Front, you have Germany versus France and the United Kingdom, later the United States. The Eastern Front, you have Germany and Austria versus Russia, okay? You will add countries like Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, and then as you see right here, Italy will join the Allied side. So this map will slightly change, but basically you have a Western Front and an Eastern Front of the war. Now in Western Europe, the soil is better for farming, so it's much easier to dig. And so the soldiers on the Western Front will dig these things called trenches, which are like ditches that are 6 to 8 feet deep. And they do so to hide from these new horrific weapons like these bigger cannons and these machine guns and such. And so what they dig is a trench, and then they dig support trenches or supply trenches behind them in order to get supplies to the front. This is probably the best photograph of trenches, and this is a German trench right here, and then a British and French trench right here. And you can see right here is no man's land, okay? No man's land is where you fight. It's usually anywhere from a soccer field in length between 2 trenches. And the goal here is to take the enemy trench, and if you take the enemy trench, then the enemy has to retreat to its reserve trenches. So it's a really costly way to fight a battle. So this is the reality of trench life. It's really dirty. It's really smelly because a lot of these battlefields have a lot of sulfur in them. So if you've ever been to the hot springs near Awachapan, you've smelled that sulfuric smell before. And it's also really rainy in this part of Europe. So it's just, you're constantly wet. You constantly have wet clothing and wet shoes. So you get a lot of diseases like this, okay, like gangrene, what's called trench foot. Sometimes they'd have to cut your foot off because your foot would become so diseased. Also, you have a lot of fun things like rats and fleas and lice. So it's just a really terrible way to fight. Remember, guys, these are the most sophisticated people in the world if you were to believe social Darwinism, and they're basically living in a hole fighting. This is an even better photograph, and you can see how people would actually sleep in these trenches. So this is a short clip from a movie called All Quiet on the Western Front that was made after a book came out called All Quiet on the Western Front. And it's written by a German talking about what it was like to live and fight in trenches. So as you can see, this is not an easy way to fight. Now the war basically starts when Germany invades France, because Germany has a problem. They have to fight in France, and they have to fight against Russia at the same time. So they concentrate most of their forces to quickly invade and hopefully quickly defeat France. To do this, they have to go over the flattest land possible, which means invading Belgium right here. Belgium is flat, so it's faster than going through the forest, as you can see right here. So the idea here is to quickly defeat the French and then put all of your forces in Russia to win the war. This is called the Schlieffen Plan. The problem here is that the Germans get a little nervous that they're leaving so many of their soldiers to defend the Russians, and they will sort of take some soldiers away from this invasion, and they make a quick left turn before they get to Paris, which exposes their army, and the British and the French are able to fight back and win this battle called the Battle of the Marne, which is a river, and this stops the German invasion. From here, the Germans will dig in, and they will dig trenches, as you can see right here. And then the British and the French dig trenches, and for the rest of the war, they are fighting a trench battle in the Western Front. Now, two of the absolute worst battles of the war, and probably in the history of fighting, are right here at Verdun, which is a German attack on a French fort, and here at the Battle of the Somme, which is a British-led attack on the Germans. Both of these battles last more than 10 months. They are both trench battles, and in the end, we're talking about 2 million casualties in these two battles. Remember, casualties, someone dead or wounded in the war. And all in all, about 10 miles of land are won or lost, okay? which is really nothing compared to all the casualties. So it really shows you that trench fighting is really hard. We'll talk about it more tomorrow in class. It's hard on the body, but it's probably even worse on the mind. As bad as the Western Front is, we forget about the Eastern Front, which is probably even worse because they couldn't fight in trenches. The ground is too hard to dig. So instead, they're fighting just like they would normally do above ground with these new weapons. You can see just in the casualty rates just how bad life was on the East. Russia has the largest army in the war, and 76% of their 12 million soldiers that fight are dead or wounded by the end of the war. Their main enemy, Austria, has a 90% casualty rate of their 8 million soldiers. So the question I'll leave you with is, how do you break this stalemate? A stalemate is a tie. Neither side is winning right now. So how do you win this war? Have a good night. See you tomorrow.